In this chapter, we're going to talk about starting our props. I call it finding the crack. It's kind of a lame name, but I think it's a good term for kind of what we're talking about here. It's basically after the blockout phase, we need to start filling out the scene with high-res props, with finished props, and that can be a pretty daunting thing. So I usually choose 1 or 2 props and then kind of go at it, finish them up, and start from there. And that kind of leads into a bigger process of finishing things out. A few things I want to touch on here is basically my process of making the props, designing them, and how I approach them, and what I'm worried about and what I'm not worried about. But I also want to clarify, like, this isn't really like a click-by-click tutorial on how to model or how to use ZBrush or how to use Maya or any of that sort of stuff. I'm assuming at this point most of you guys know how to do this stuff, or you have tons of access through the Gnomon workshop or other tutorials online to help with that kind of basic stuff. This is more of a higher level view of how to approach this subject and how to really kind of take those skills that you've learned and kind of improve on them. So let's jump into the scene and kind of see where we're choosing to start from. Our blockout's looking pretty good. We have the overall layout done. We have detail in some good areas, and we're basically ready to move on, right? I can't really keep blocking out any further at this point. So what I like to do normally at this point is take a prop that I know needs to get done and just make it, and even just like finish it. Just because there's so much to do at this point, I like to just stop and not worry about it and just try and pick one thing and do it. So in this case, I just arbitrarily chose like this stool to make for the ramen shop. Again, this was quickly blocked out based off reference and stuff like that. But I know it needed to get done, so I started working on it. So let's take a look at some of the reference I found. As always, this is the sort of thing that's like, as soon as you start, you find as much reference as possible, right? So I found a bunch of ramen stools, you know, on the internet. Looking at a lot of the reference in Tokyo obviously helped. Even in Los Angeles at our ramen stores, there was one thing I really noticed a lot of, which were these like red stools at a lot of these places. It was like a very common thing that I saw. So even here, there's like a red stool, different kind of stool, red stool. So I don't know why, but when I thought of a ramen place, I thought of like a red stool, and I found a bunch of reference that kind of went along with that. But I didn't want to just do a boring red stool. I wanted to mix it up a little bit, and this is something that I do sometimes. A lot of times I'll just find something that looks cool and I'll model it, but other times I'll try and kind of design my own prop, right? And depending on how important it is. Again, since this was something that was first and early on, I wanted to kind of like design something a little bit further or a little bit different than just your normal boring red stool. So I kind of saw these sorts of stools a lot at different bars and places to eat as well, and a lot of the reference, and also being in Tokyo, and they have that really kind of iconic swoop here. And so I decided to kind of just take a stab at like combining those two things together. So my first stab at that was, so the goal was to combine those two elements, right? The swoop of the kind of older stool, and then the kind of vinyl, the red vinyl classic, you know, looking ramen stool. So I have a video of me just kind of quickly blocking this out, but it's not important to kind of watch the whole thing. But I do kind of want to show just a bit of my process. So again, just looking at reference here, and I'm just quickly going through here and modeling it out, right? We all know how to do this stuff. This is just basic, you know, poly modeling stuff. So here, you know, I'm just doing the swoop, and sometimes I will do a photo bash of these two elements together to kind of get an idea of what I want to do. But since I knew kind of more or less what I wanted, I thought I'd just kind of concept it in 3D, really. And the reason I did that for this prop, and a lot of this, again, comes from experience and just comes from doing it a lot. But I knew, like, if I do a stool bottom like this, right, like, I can model it out as kind of part of my quote concept. And if the concept doesn't work, I can still reuse the stool bottom for the next iteration. Modeling something like this on the top is pretty quick and easy to do, so that's not a big deal. If this was like a really complex shape where I needed to make a lot of custom models for it just to see if it would work, then I would probably go in and try and do a bit more of a photo bash technique in Photoshop instead of wasting the time of doing it in here. So this thing, I decided to add the cross section here real quickly. Again, it's hinting at what these older stools were like, and I thought it'd be cool to kind of add it as kind of feel like a footrest almost on the ramen stool that a lot of these things don't have. So instead of like putting it up higher like it was, I put it a little bit lower. Just so it felt like it had functionality to it, but also had the style to it. And I think that's, you know, key to making this stuff feel real. So after this, this is one of the few things I actually really ZBrushed in this scene, just because of the amount of props there was. I didn't have the time or the luxury to really spend this much time on every prop. But since this was the first prop, you know, the one that I was really trying to kickstart the process with, I decided to go real crazy with it. And so really it was just adding the details, making it feel soft and like cloth and feeling good. Nothing, again, nothing crazy, real basic stuff. Just pushing and pulling around. And really I'm just doing it on this section. There's one thing I want to show here, which is I made a really quick alpha here to kind of add some of this, again, this kind of vinyl pinching look. So I just quickly wanted to talk about this alpha that I'm using here, and just kind of, it's really the only like slightly fancy thing I did at all as far as, you know, the ZBrush stuff goes. Like I said, it's all just really basic stuff, just kind of making it look a little soft and clothy. All I really did was just search Google for cloth alpha. That's all I did. This image showed up from this guy on his website here, Joel Mongyan. I don't really know how to say that, I'm sorry. But it showed up here, and it's actually a pretty nice little Marvelous Designer tutorial here. The guy is clearly quite the badass. But, you know, I found this image here. And, you know, that's just kind of the way when you're doing these kinds of things, moving quickly. Like, I just found it. I'm not trying to sell this alpha as my own or anything like that, but I found it really useful. So I opened it up in Photoshop. And basically what I did here is I grabbed it in Photoshop. I grayscaled it. That's really all I did to it. And I mirrored it right down the middle. So basically the middle point here is right in the middle of the image. And that just makes it easier for the alpha. I believe I also just quickly did an offset here. Oops. It's just so it tiles, and all I did was plug that into the Stitch Basic brush in ZBrush. I didn't even create my own brush. I just slammed the alpha in there, and then as I would hit the edges, I would just kind of change my draw size and intensity and stuff, and just draw it along the edge there. And just get some detail in there, and that's really all I did. Again, most of the props, all of the props, I will say, other than this one, did not get any other love like that. Just because this sort of stuff, as you'll see as we move forward, can really be added in the Photoshop process, and there's just too many props in this scene to be able to do that for everything. But for here, it worked great. It looks nice, and again, moving forward, right? Like just picking a prop, having fun with it this night. Came home from work, just decided to go at it and really not get bogged down on process. I just wanted to create something cool so I could put it in the scene and then create something else cool. That's really the key to this step. I wanted to show another prop here that I tackled during this process. If looking at the blackout again, you can see just right over here, this is probably why I picked it. It was just right next to this. It was these crates, and while I was looking at all the reference of things, I started noticing these crates all over the place. So these Kirin beer crates, and in any like Tokyo Alleyway image that I found pretty much had them. Like, it's almost like a Where's Waldo to find these things. They're literally like all over the place. So that's why they were kind of in there in the first place, and it was something easy I could kind of tackle. So as usual, I start by finding as much reference of them as possible, just so I have a clear idea of what I'm making. So I find when I'm looking for my reference, there's couple things I do. One, I'm looking for good reference of what the object looks like. And I'm also keeping an eye out for things like this, which is like perfect for making a texture, like a logo from the texture with. So this one, even though it wasn't the best to try and really figure out the shape of the crate, it was like perfect for grabbing the logo. So I just grabbed a bunch of these, right? Different sizes, different shapes, and here you can see I actually made the logo out of it at some point to use in the texture. So I think this is kind of the one that I ended up using. And I basically just started modeling it. So I'm not going to go too far into the actual technical modeling of this. Most of what I'm doing is just poly modeling. Most of what I do is just simple poly modeling, the stuff that we've learned really early on. I'm just looking at my reference and recreating my reference. I do some ZBrush stuff, some booleans type stuff, but overall it's all just basic stuff. I do want to talk about a couple really important points though. When you're working with environments, it's typically not one prop selling the environment. It's usually the culmination of the props that's actually making the environment feel like a real place. So having your prop be technically perfect all the time isn't always necessary. So you should pay attention to when something's kind of a big important story piece and when it's not. So things like crates and boxes, typically you can work a little bit faster through them and not worry about edge flow and perfect, quads and all of that stuff every single time. When you're working at work, obviously that's a little bit of a different beast. You might be passing it off for someone else to texture. It's going to be maybe animated. You're not really sure if it's going to be used in another project later on. Those sorts of things you really need to take your time and make sure you have a technically perfect model. But for your personal art pieces, you have a lot of leeway to tell yourself and to figure out when is something important and when is it not. With new tools like people using CAD modeling now, ZBrush, all these cool different Boolean tools and plugins and stuff, there's quicker ways to create geometry that looks good, but maybe the geometry is a little wacky or it's decimated or whatever. And just don't be afraid of that sort of stuff. If needed, you can go and retopologize it, but a lot of times you won't have to. Your models still need to look good, but they don't need to be technically perfect every time. And just remember, as I said, the whole is what's important. It's not one prop that's selling it. So that you should always be focusing on that. It's also kind of nice that with working with environments, one thing that I really like while working with environments is a lot of times is the imperfections in your models can actually help give it a little bit more of a realistic feel, because everything in the real world isn't this perfect extruded and edge looped out perfect model. There's always like slight imperfections all over the place. So when we actually have some of that in our model, it's actually going to add up to being a much more interesting scene. So we're going to focus much more on the why we're doing things and why we're approaching them a certain way, and a little bit less on the technical how-to. So it's easy for me to say, oh, I use my experience to figure out how much effort it takes to put into a model. But that's not really helpful for a tutorial, is it? So I want to talk about kind of how we can break this down, how we can think about this as we're putting this stuff together, even if we don't have a lot of experience with this stuff. So let's take a look at this scene, for instance, the one that we're working on currently. So this is our block out, right? And this is the camera we set up. This was a step that I specifically said is important, and a step that I take every time I do something like this. Whether it be an illustration or even working on the game, there's always a block out. Working on a game, there's always a block out for this stuff. So for instance, this block out, these are the crates that I'm looking at. So I know that these are kind of close to the camera, but it's not right up close here. It's not like foreground. But I also know that I'm probably going to be rendering this out at a fairly large resolution, meaning that even though it's not right up in the camera, they still need to look pretty good. Like I can't get away with just like texture mapping a box, right? I need a good solid model. But I'm not trying to show this off as like, hey, look at this amazing crate I made. It just needs to look good at this range. Now, it's possible I'll reuse this model in some other places, and that's something you should think about. Here's where it's placed now, which means it needs to look this good, a specific amount. It's possible that it'll be used in other areas. So if it's going to be used closer, you know, error on making it look a little bit better than you think it should look. And that's really all there is to it. So things like the inside of the crate, which I said I had some trouble with, I'm really never going to show the inside of the crate. There's really no reason why I would ever really need to show that without something in it, for instance. So even if I do show it, it'll be full of something. So I knew I can kind of be a little bit lax on that. But overall, it still needed to look good. So that's one of the ways you can think about it. To use another example from a scene I worked on before. So this is another sci-fi scene I worked on. So again, with this, there's a lot of props in this, and not as many as the one that we're working on currently, but still quite a few props. But one of the ways I was able to get around this was I blocked this out and set the camera angle very early on. So I knew that all of this stuff we're looking at, how far it's going to be from the camera and how it's going to be used. So let's take a look at some of these props, right? So some of these books just aren't textured on their sides at all. Other ones are textured on their sides, but their textures don't match up with what they're actually showing, because I wasn't showing off the books. They're just in there. Like, let's zoom into some of these, right? So like they're just in here. Like they just needed to have something on them. They didn't need to match up. Some of these other books, like these ones, have just stretch textures. Again, there's something there. There needs to be something there just in case you see a little piece, but they didn't need to be fully textured. Again, I knew how they were being used. I thought about it. Experience or not, I have my camera angle made. I can think about this and figure it out. Same with the magazines. Lots of repeating textures, lots of that sort of stuff, but enough noise to where how I use them was fine. And then even looking at some of my geometry, pretty sketchy geometry here, guys. Floating textures for the logos, that sort of stuff. But again, this is how big it is, and it looks fine in the final scene. So even though some of you guys may not have the experience of putting together a lot of these scenes, this is a way that you can kind of stop and think about what you're doing. This is why we're going through these steps. This blockout phase is so important, because we're able to stop and think about not just our composition, but even beer can. How is this beer can being used in this scene? How much detail does it need? That's why these early steps we're taking are so important. So I hope that clarifies some of this stuff. Being not a great modeler isn't an excuse for a bad model. It just means you need to put a little bit more time on it, and it just means that you can be more efficient in areas that don't really call for the badass model.